So our next presentation is going to be by Deb Freeman. There's bios you might have noticed in the programs for everybody, but Deb, I'll just mention, is an attorney and a partner with the law firm of Trout, Raley, Montano, Whitwer, and Freeman. And much of Deb's practice emphasizes regulatory compliance. And that's really what she's going to talk to us about today, and that is the permitting process. And Deb, you do get the award for alliteration in your title, Prospective Poudre Projects Pursuing Permits. Way to get all those P's in there. Folks, please help me welcome Deb Freeman to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. There are a host of requirements that are involved in the development of any water project. I've got 15 minutes this afternoon, so by definition, my comments are going to be very general and by way of overview. What I wanted to do, though, is to try to summarize for you all what are the regulatory requirements, what are the environmental reviews that are done, what are the permitting requirements that come into play with any water project, but certainly with those that are proposed on the Poudre. After that, I'm going to just touch on ever so briefly where the three Poudre projects, the Northern Integrated Supply Project, NISP, Halligan, and Seaman, just procedurally where they are in the process. With any water project, with the three Poudre projects, really the chief federal permit that is at issue is a Clean Water Act 404 individual permit. And 404, it regulates the discharge, which really means just the placement of fill material into waters of the U.S. Think streams, think drainages, think wetlands. So construction work, if there is work being done on a diversion facility, if there is work being done to construct or enlarge storage, generally that involves a discharge and requires a 404 permit. That is the case with the Poudre projects. The decision by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to grant or deny the 404 permit, that pulls in a number of procedural and substantive requirements. I'm going to go through and summarize those quickly. Clearly, the biggest procedural requirement is NEPA compliance. The National Environmental Policy Act, where you have a proposal by a federal agency that constitutes a major federal action, that is the trigger for needing to prepare an EIS. That process has been underway on the Poudre projects. The reason I list it as a procedural requirement, sometimes we forget this, but an EIS really is a disclosure document. By definition, what it does is it discloses impacts of a proposal, alternatives and their impacts to that proposal, proposed mitigation, and also things that can't be mitigated, the remaining consequences. And the purpose of the EIS is really twofold. One is it is for the public. It is to advise the public of what is going on and to get public input on impacts, on alternatives, on mitigation. It's also designed as kind of an information piece to make sure that the federal permitting agency has taken a hard look at those things, at impacts, at alternative courses of action, so it makes a really knowing decision on the permit application. NEPA compliance can take years. And I think that we've seen that along the Front Range. The Corps, Omaha District, their regulatory branch, issues a status report on the Front Range EISs that the Corps is in the lead on. The status report that came out in January, I was looking at it, there is not one of these major Front Range EISs that has been completed or that is slated to be completed in under a decade. 10 years for an EIS. And you know, as a practitioner in the area, I don't see that as a reflection poorly on any of the proposed projects. I don't view it as a bad reflection on the permitting agencies. I think it is inherent in the NEPA process that is just complex. You know, there are a number of things at play. These are very technical issues, as I think you all appreciate, on environmental impacts, particularly with water projects. The permitting agencies have to decide what is the scope of a given EIS. What are the methods of analysis of an EIS? What are the alternatives? What things should be modeled? How should they be modeled? Very, very technical calls. The processes on an EIS take so long that frequently you have to change things midstream just because you've been at it for so long. There's new science. There's new agency policies. The law might change. Agency personnel might change. So going through a NEPA process sometimes can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, just trying to adjust to a changing landscape as things go forward. It is a very public process, and that builds in time. There are good ideas that come from the public. They need to be considered. They need to be factored in. Sometimes that changes the EIS, and it builds in more time to complete it. It is also a federally driven process by definition. And so it is the federal agencies that are going to be making the calls as to scope, as to the schedule, as to what issues are important or are not important. A project proponent does not dictate an EIS. Opponents really don't dictate an EIS. The feds do. Local governments that are proponents of activities, they end up paying a lot of the bill for the analysis, but they fundamentally don't control it. Just very quickly, EISs are issued in draft and in final. Public comment. There are a number of opportunities to participate in an EIS. One of the key ones is at the scoping stage early on. Another big juncture is when the draft EIS comes out. There can be hearings at the draft EIS stage. As the agency then moves toward the final EIS, typically in the final EIS there will be refined analysis that has been done subsequent to the draft. The final EIS may also pick up and benefit from some of the local processes that go forward based on the draft EIS, and the final EIS will respond to comments that were received during the public comment period. Typically, the Corps plans on about a year between the draft and the final. Could be more, could be less. So that's procedurally. Substantively, I'm just going to fly through stuff that is really should not be summarized only on one slide, but 4 main tests on the substance with a Corps permit. These are known, they are embodied in the 404B1 guidelines, which are really regulatory, notwithstanding the term guidelines. The first one is the LEDPA test. The Corps needs to find that a proposal is the least environmentally damaging way of meeting the purpose and the need of the undertaking. Second, that the proposal, that the project is not going to violate a host of other laws that are on the books. I'll touch on those in a few minutes. Third, that appropriate and practicable steps have been taken to minimize adverse impacts. That's basically the requirement for a rigorous mitigation plan. I think in this day and age, proponents of projects appreciate the importance of a very meaningful and well thought out mitigation plan. And finally, that the project, after considering mitigation, is not going to have remaining impacts that amount to significant degradation. Those are at the crux of the Corps' permitting criteria. There's also a public interest review that the Corps undertakes, which is a general balancing test. All the benefits of a proposal compared to all the negatives. Where is that balance struck? There, the test is that the permit should issue unless it is found to be contrary to the overall public interest. I'd mentioned that there is public input also on the Corps' permitting decision, not just on the EIS. And the Corps ultimately will look at the EIS, will look at its regulatory criteria and make a decision, and it embodies that in a record of decision and in a permit with terms and conditions that are enforceable to make sure that environmental and other commitments are made, assuming it chooses to issue a permit. Very quickly, I've concentrated on the Corps here because that is the main permit at issue with the proposed Poudre projects. Other federal agencies could have their own decision-making. Reclamation approvals, for facilities that interface with reclamation facilities. I put Department of Transportation here on the slide. An example there would be with the NISP project and the relocation of a proposed relocation of a portion of Highway 287. Two other federal laws fairly reliably come into play where you have federal permitting. The first is the Endangered Species Act. There, the burden on a federal agency when it issues a permit is that that activity can't likely jeopardize federally listed species or adversely modify critical habitat. That's done through assured through a Section 7 consultation process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. On the Poudre projects, I think the equation there is both one to look at considerations related to on-site species. An example would be the Preble's jumping mouse, and also off-site species, which relate to tracing the depletive effects downstream. Most all of the Front Range projects, water projects that have gone through in recent years have addressed the downstream species through participation in a basin-wide 3-state Platte River recovery program that has been highly successful, and contributing toward that program as their means of addressing the Platte River species. The other federal statute that comes into play is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and there Federal agencies must take into consideration impact on properties that are eligible for listing or are listed on the National Register, and typically that works through development of a programmatic agreement between the permitting agency, the State Historic Preservation Officer, SHPO, the Advisory Council, and an agreement on how an undertaking would move forward in terms of detailed inventories for cultural resources and protocols for what you do if you find something by way of identifying it, avoiding it, or documenting it. So those are the federal reviews summarized very quickly. I merely want to mention two state processes without getting into any real detail on them, but they are important. The first is the State Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Planning process. You'll hear that referred to as the 122.2 process. Ken, are you still here from CPW? There he is. You may correct me if there's anything I misstate here. But under this process, a project proponent is required to develop a mitigation plan and present that to the state by way of a proposal to address fish and wildlife needs. That proposal is typically developed after the draft EIS comes out, so there's a factual predicate on impacts that need to be addressed. That is presented, it goes through a hearing process before the state, before the commission, Parks and Wildlife, and ultimately, as it moves forward, goes to CWCB. An approved plan that is worked through that process, once approved, really does become the state's position on mitigation required of an applicant for fish and wildlife, and that is transmitted over to the federal permitting agencies. The other process, very quickly, is the 401 water quality certification process. That is triggered also through a discharge, similar to what triggers a 404 permit. And there, through the state process, which also tends to kick in once there is factual development through the EIS, the Water Quality Control Division looks at impacts and must conclude that there is reasonable assurance of compliance with water quality standards. There is also an anti-degradation review that is performed for high-quality reviewable waters, which do exist in segments on the Poudre. And there the criteria is that looking to see whether there are new water quality impacts which would have a potential to significantly degrade those waters. And if so, they go through a finding of necessity as part of that evaluation. And then, of course, there are local approvals for any of these undertakings. Just, by way of stepping back generally, these are very comprehensive reviews. As I mentioned, the NEPA processes are running a decade on the big projects. The federal EIS process, once it comes through at the draft EIS stage, goes out for public comment, and at that point, many of the other reviews, the state reviews, those processes are initiated. As you work through these processes, each agency is going to apply its own legal criteria. It's going to assess things based on its specific regulatory lens. That being the case, I think within that, there is room for public input. There is room for some constructive dialogue. What are good ways to minimize impacts? What are constructive mitigation opportunities? Where are there opportunities actually for resource enhancements that can be part of projects moving forward? There is room within that framework to bring those issues forward and to have that, that dialogue. Let me just touch ever so quickly on the Poudre projects, just procedurally where they are. The NISP project with Glade and Gailton proposed reservoirs. The EISs started on those projects quite some time ago. The draft EIS originally came out in 2008. The Corps decided to do a supplemental draft, and one of the big undertakings that it accomplished was to do a what it calls a common technical platform, a common hydrologic modeling approach that the Corps could then use consistently as a way of looking at impacts. Also, there were some common protocols for other data collection and analytic methods for other resources, not just hydrology. That process was completed, and the supplemental draft EIS for NISP is scheduled to come out this summer. And public hearings would follow on the heels of it coming out, and then moving on toward the final EIS. For Halligan Seaman, that EIS process, I believe, got initiated back in 2006 or so. The Corps had been looking at both projects collectively in an EIS. As they have moved forward, Fort Collins with Halligan expansion is at the stage of looking at preliminary alternatives and analyzing those. City of Greeley with Milton Seaman is a bit further, less far along in the process, and the Corps this month formally decided that it was going to conduct a separate EIS on each of those projects. The formal Corps schedule, at least on their recent status report, is calling for the Halligan draft EIS to come out in spring of 2016, with Greeley's to follow after that. So with that, those are my comments.